Hello, friends. My name is Valéria de Paiva, and I work in the Topos Institute. And I wanted to talk to you today about dialectical categories and the reasons for our MRC, Mathematical Research Community, in applied category theory, especially with respect to the dialectical construction. I'm afraid I wasn't able to go to Beaver Hollow in the summer, and I was not able to come to Boston for the JMM. I'm really sorry. There was some medical condition that prevented me from doing that, but I'm doing fine now. So let me share my slides and start with the mathematics of that. So as I was trying to say, I am going to talk to you about dialectical categorical constructions. And this is based on joint work with Davide Trotta and Matteo Spadetto. And this is a bit like an explanation of why the MRC substream that I was to lead went the way it went. So I wanted to explain to you where the dialectical construction comes from and how it eventually ended up kind of getting us into applied category theory. And I suppose I should start by saying that I am very, very thankful to my group in the MRC, and you can see them there in Beaver Hollow. And we are kind of 13, there were 13 people in the group. And I am particularly thankful to Charlotte and Jeremy for kind of keeping the group going and doing the work of organizing the meetings and producing the conclusions and that were needed for the MRC itself, and for kind of organizing later on a visit to Cupertino to see me in September, where we kind of carried on with the work. And kind of, for me, it was a delightful surprise to have them here and to just carry on discussing these issues. Because you see, we divided a group of 13, or actually 14 if you count me, into 4 subgroups. The first one being Nelson New and dialectical constructions and polynomials. The second one, Jeremy Koenig, kind of leading the way on dialectical construction and games. The third one being that we're going to hear about in this afternoon, being Matteo Capucci talking about dialectical construction and lenses and kind of other generalizations of the ideas. And finally, the more applied work by Charlotte and Eric Bond on dialectical Petronet processes. And I'm very pleased that despite the fact that I had this medical condition coming up, everyone managed to sit down and do the work, and I'm very, very proud of you guys. But so back to the dialectical construction itself, it starts kind of quite a long time ago with Kurt Gödel, who in 1958 kind of published this paper on the dialectical interpretation. So the paper was published in German and in a volume in honor of Paul Bernays. And Gödel never managed to have published the English version of the paper, because I think he, to the last days of his life, he was kind of still thinking about how to make the paper better, while kind of using the translation as a reason for doing that. And the paper and the dialectic itself, the construction, the logical construction that he had, is a very interesting one, because it deals with several of the themes of the beginning of the 20th century logic. So it deals with this idea that that classical mathematics is somehow at odds with constructive mathematics, and you might want to decide how much of each you want to pay attention to. It deals with this idea that that you don't want to have quantifiers nesting too deeply because things get too complicated. It deals with the idea that the Brouwer-Haitink-Kolmogorov interpretation is a very exciting idea, but it is very abstract. And Gödel himself thought that he could think of it in terms of functions from natural numbers to natural numbers and higher order versions of those. So the stereo functions of finite type that nowadays we call Gödel's system T, that this was a more concrete way of thinking about logic and arithmetic than the PHK interpretation. Gödel's main use of the interpretation was to say that if Haitink arithmetic proves a certain formula A, then system T, which has no quantifiers but has this higher order functionals, proves a kind of a version of the original formula A, where you have X as a string of variables kind of taking care of the functions of finite type, and where T is a suitable sequence of terms not containing X. So you are kind of reducing the complexity of your A to this string of functions of type of finite type and some terms, and you want to do that in a constructive way, meaning as constructive as possible, meaning that you explain how you transform every sentence of Haitink arithmetic into a sentence of the dialectic interpretation in the most constructive way possible. And that is very well explained by Professor Troster, who left us recently, in Gödel's collected works from 1986. Now, some people say that Gödel's work is very tricky, very full of interesting but complicated ideas intertwined. And one of the things that we kind of do in this work is to actually try to translate that into category theory, because we think that clarifies quite a few of those tricky insights of Gödel's. In any case, everyone agrees that the complicated clause of Gödel's interpretation is the definition of the translation of the implication connective. And as you can see in this slide, if you have an implication of formula A implies formula B, and you kind of want to do the dialectical version of it, the dialectic interpretation version of it, you have this somewhat complicated expression which has two functionals, capital V, which takes type little u to v. So kind of you get functionals of u, so v of u, and a functional capital X, which takes more complicated still variables of type u and variables of type y, and kind of produces a functional of type X. So here is where the genius of Gödel come in, and you say, well, why this somewhat complicated translation of implication? Because if you're just thinking naturally in terms of proofs, you think to yourself that, okay, whenever I want to have a proof of an implication, I have to transform proofs of the antecedent into proofs of the consequent. And that is happening here. That's why you have this capital V of U. It's taking U's, which are proofs of A, into proofs of B. But the extra trick that Gödel provides us with is this idea that, not only you have to take proofs to proofs, but you have to take counterexamples of the consequent back into counterexamples of the antecedent of the premise. And moreover, this counterexample needs to be localized on the proof of the antecedent. So you have a counterexample of the shape UX, a counterexample of type X, using as arguments the proof of A and a counterexample of B. And that's not this is tricky enough, but it's not enough for the dialectica to work, as Professor Troster kind of shows in his exegesis of the interpretation. He shows that the translation also involves three logical principles: the principle of independence of premise, a generalization of Markov's principle, and a version of axiom of choice, which is kind of a version of skolemization. And what this new work of Trotter and Spadetto kind of provides us with is an explanation of all these logical principles in categorical terms. I won't have time to be very careful about that. So this is mostly a teaser, a trailer, kind of to try to get you to read the preprints. But let's carry on with the first level of categorification of this work. So the first level happened billions of years ago when I was doing my PhD thesis, which I finished in 1988. But I presented this stuff in another AMS meeting in 1987. And at that stage, what I kind of had, because my supervisor, Martin Hyland, kind of had this very clever suggestion of how to construct an internal version of Gödel's dialectica. So what he said was, take a category C with finite limits and build a new category, which at that stage I called DC, but now I call dial C to be a bit more informative. And think of it as having objects, triples of the form U, X, and alpha. And U and X are objects of C, and alpha is simply a sub-object of U cross X. And think to yourself that that represents the formula that exists in U for all X, alpha of UX. So far, so good, and very easy to think about these objects, and lots of other people thought of similar sorts of objects. What kind of, as I was saying, is the big thing about Gödel was how to map one object of this shape to another object of this shape. And for that, we will use two maps or terms, if you want to think kind of in Curry-Howard terms, F0 and F1. And as I was mentioning before, F0 simply takes U's into V's, and F1 takes U and Y's into X's. And moreover, the predicates that we were thinking of, so the alphas and the betas, they have to be connected by an entailment. So alpha of U, F1 of UY implies the beta of the F0 of UY. And to make this entailment categorical, we will use kind of an entailment in the sub-objects of UX. So this is the first internalization of the dialectic interpretation, but many others came after that. My own work was mostly on the categorical structure needed to model linear logic, which was coming up at that stage because Girard introduced it in 1987. And this was all very good because Girard was very happy when I kind of showed that to him, because it showed that linear logic had a high pedigree. It could be linked back to Kurt Gödel. And the category theorists that I showed that were also very excited because the category theory required for the modeling of this new logic that was coming up and being very much talked about was all category theory that the category theorists had already developed for other reasons. In particular, the modeling of the logic in terms of symmetric monoidal closed categories with appropriate comonads was something that seemed pretty obvious to the category theorists. A symmetric monoidal closed category is just a weakening of a Cartesian closed category. And comonads, well, the comonads were more complicated and took much more work to make them into good category theory, but people did it. And this construction then was generalized initially by Hyland in 2002 in a paper for the Festschrift of Troster himself, and then by Beering on her PhD thesis, and Hofstra in 2011 in a kind of place in a volume for Michael Mackay, one of the main guys in doing categorical proof, categorical logic, and then Tamara von Glen in 2016 and Sean Moss in 2018. Etc. Because von Glen and Moss and even Beering and stuff, the things were getting more into computer science and the applications in computer science. Now, much more recently, when at the beginning of the pandemic, David Trotter kind of contacted me because he wanted to know about the conditions that I needed for the Dialectica, and kind of wanted to just dissect whether what was the problem with co-products, because I only had weak co-products in the Dialectica construction that I already sketched, but we'll see in a minute a little bit more. And together, the three of us, David, Matteo, and myself, we kind of came up with 3 preprints that, as I was saying, this is a teaser for, and it should be coming up in a journal sometime soon, we hope. But you know, for me, the kind of essential bit of this work with them was to show that the dialectical construction, the original dialectical construction, is not simply an analogy to what Gödel himself was doing, but actually we can show that all the details of the logical construction, some of them that Gödel himself probably did not know because were worked out by people like Spector and Troster and Goodman and other people, that all of them have correspondences in the categorical modeling that we came up with. So we'll then kind of, so what we do here is, so we can capture the essential ingredients of Gödel original translation. And how do we show that? Well, we kind of came up with this simplification of Bülow-Vier's notion of hyperdoctrine, which we call simply a doctrine. We kind of considered doctrines that are existential and universal doctrines, something that had been considered before. But then we came up with the notion of a Gödel doctrine and showed that this is what we need to have a categorical interpretation of the dialectica. So given a doctrine P, we want to know when there is a doctrine P prime such that the dialectica of this P prime is P. And when such a doctrine P prime exists, such that we can apply the dialectical construction to it to get a P, how do we find it? How do we discover what is the P prime, that the dial of P prime is P? And that's what we intend to sort out in this quick talk. So, you know, to destroy the building up of the talk, giving away the punchline, such a P prime exists precisely when P is a Gödel doctrine. And how do we find it? Well, P prime is given by the quantifier-free elements of the Gödel doctrine P. So it is one of those talks where you do reverse engineering of where you want to get, and the reverse engineering works. So we invent a notion of a Gödel doctrine, we invent a notion of quantifier-free elements of a doctrine, and we show that all that we needed to prove about these Gödel doctrines and these quantifier-free elements is true. Now, the way that we prove that then these definitions were the correct ones, it's because we can then show that classical principles that Troster and others kind of showed about dialectica, that is the independence of premise principle, the Markov principle, and the axiom of choice in the shape of this colonization, are all satisfied in our model. And this is kind of a big deal, at least for me, because I think, Biologia showed us in the early 60s that we could do categorical logic, but not lots has happened in terms of being able to describe in categorical terms what happens when you have quantifier-free formulae. And at least in the setting of the dialectica, now we do have a notion of quantifier-free elements, which, about time, right? Kind of 40 years later. So we first start with this simplification of Flovier's notion of hyperdoctrine. And so we just define a doctrine as a functor from a category C with finite products to the category of posets, POS. We recall the notion of existential and universal doctrines defined by, I think, Maietti and Rossolini and other people, but we're just reusing some of their work. And we say that, a doctrine P, a functor as above, is existential if for every A1 and A2 in the category C and every projection of a product, the functor that is the image of the doctrine has a left adjoint, if we want to talk about existential doctrines, and a right adjoint if we want to talk about the universal doctrines, and these guys have to satisfy the Bakhtin conditions. So far so good, all like you'd be expecting. Now, to get the existential freeness and the universal freeness, it gets a little bit more complicated. And I'm not going to go there because we would have to discuss quite a lot about internal languages of categories, internal languages, and internal language theorems, which I don't have time to talk about, but you can check our archive preprint. The point being that, if we're trying to, if you have an arrow A to I in the category C, and you have a predicate over F of A that entails an existential predicate in B, then you can you say that the predicate alpha is existential free if there is an unique arrow G such that the existential B in B here can be transformed into this element G of A. So, it's just kind of reasonable, right? If you have an implication into an existential, we can transform this existential into instantiation of your existential quantifier. Now, it gets more and more involved, and we not only have to talk about existential free, predicates, but we also have to talk about enough existential free predicates. And after quite a bit of playing around with these notions, we get to this, as I was saying, reverse engineered definition of a Gödel doctrine. So a doctrine P is called a Gödel doctrine if the category C is Cartesian closed, the doctrine P is existential and universal, the doctrine P has enough existential free predicates, the existential free objects of P are stable under universal quantification, and the subdoctrine P prime, or the existential free predicates of P, has enough universal predicates. So it's a mouthful, and I'm not able to give you a very good explanation of all the conditions in the 3 minutes that I have. But I hope you kind of take the time to go and look them up. And having come up with this special notion, we can start using it up and getting the theorems we want. So the first theorem we want is to say that that when Gödel says that a formula, oops, that's my time. I think that I'm at the end of that I should be finishing up. I have 4 theorems here, which I thought I had more time to describe. So one being that the objects of our category correspond to the objects of the formulae in the dialectic interpretation, that the morphisms in our category, that is this F0s and F1s, correspond to the implication in the logic, as we expected from the fact that that was a difficult definition that Gödel provided us. That we have a reasonable amount of choice. I mean, we have a sensible amount of choice given by this colonization principle, which is actually a theorem of Peter Hofstra that kind of we can just import for this doctrinal framework. And finally, that the dialectical completion of the full subdoctrine P prime of P is the quantifier free predicates of P. So for a Gödel doctrine. So we have these 4 theorems showing that everything that happens in the logic happens in the categorical modeling. And moreover, we have to show when we kind of put more structure back, because we need to have conjunctions and disjunctions as well as existential and universal quantifiers. So when we put this stuff back to have hyperdoctrines and have a natural notion of a Gödel hyperdoctrine, then we will satisfy both the rule of independence of premise and the modified Markov rule. And with all this and the connecting theorem showing that the rules can be made into principles, we end up here that we showed how to model quantifier free formula using the dialectica-based doctrines. We proved that the Gödel doctrine satisfy the existence of a dialectical normal form, a soundness of implication, which I said to you was the main thing, and that the doctrines that we have satisfy the 3 principles that we know are satisfied by the dialectical interpretation. So it's colonization, dependence of premise, and Markov's principle. So we have a very faithful description of the dialectical interpretation. Now, what I wanted to show today, and I decided early on that wasn't possible, so I wanted to show you how to connect that to the notions of triposis and toposis that are already available, particularly in Beering's PhD thesis. But that will be for another talk, because I think what I just showed will at least show you where some of the work that the guys are going to talk about this afternoon comes from, and I think should give you some sort of feeling for the how interesting and exceptional it is that all this stuff kind of had been thought about by Gödel in the 1940s to a certain extent. All this stuff that had been thought by Gödel in the 1940s can be made into categorical, exciting work. And I would like at some other time to try and make clear the connections to realizability through triples and toposes, but won't be today. So thank you. And here are the references. I'm not going to be able to answer questions immediately, but I'd be delighted if anyone wanted to write and ask me about more, ask me, David or Matteo, about any of this stuff. Thank you very much.